Good morning and welcome. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. This morning, we're going to be talking about Chad, and certainly things have been very eventful and interesting in Chad, including Chad and across the Sahel over the last year or two. And here to talk about it, we have three folks I could not recommend higher for their expertise on this subject. First hosting us today as our moderator is Charles Ray, Ambassador Charles Ray, who's a member of FPRI's Board of Trustees and the chair of our Africa program. He also previously served as U.S. Ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia and to the Republic of Zimbabwe. He also had a 20-year career in the U.S. military as well. And joining him today from Chad is Ambassador Alexander Laskaris, who will be speaking and part of our conversation, as well as Michael Walsh, who's a senior fellow at FPRI as well. I also want to remind you that we'll be taking your questions about halfway through the program, but don't wait to put them in the question box. We like to see those as we go along. So down at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A box. Please put them there. If you put them in the chat, there's a chance we won't see them. We'll look for them there too, but we like to get them in the Q&A box if you can. So the last thing before I turn it over to Ambassador Ray is to thank you for your support and to let you know that we can't do these programs without that support. So if you're not a member or a contributor, we please encourage you to do so. As we're fond of saying, these programs are free to you. They're not free to us. So without further ado, Ambassador Ray.
Thank you, President Flynn, and thank you all for joining us today. As you just heard, we bring you information about one of the countries of the Sahel, which is not so much really in the mainstream news here, but certainly events there loom large over the continent and over affairs on the African continent. And I really am pleased to have with us today Ambassador Alex Laskaris, who is our ambassador to Chad, coming to you from his office, as he says, in a dust storm, and Michael Walsh, who is a senior fellow with the program, who has done quite a bit of study on events in the Sahel, and not just Chad, but that entire belt of countries. Each of our speakers is going to be talking to you for about 3 or 4 minutes to introduce the topic, and then we will have a little discussion to flesh it out more before we go to you, our audience, to answer your questions. And I would like to reiterate what President Flynn said. Please put your questions in the Q&A box so we don't miss them. With that, I would like to ask Ambassador Laskaris to give us his presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ray. Thanks, Michael, everyone, for organizing this. I've been here about 18 months, at the end of about 34 years on the African continent, give or take a few here and there. I think one of the most remarkable or impressionate giving conversations I've had in my time here, about 6 months ago, I was up in Faya, the main town of northern Chad, speaking to the elders, the vieux sage of the town, who were also former rebels, former soldiers. Mainly, a lot of them were retired general officers. And these are guys who had joined the rebellion in 1966. Which was the first rebellion in modern Chad. And to put that in my own personal context, the year before I was born. So Chad has been in near constant rebellion since longer than I've been around. So I asked the question of this 15 old guys, can Chad change without violence? And they looked at each other, they sort of hemmed and hawed and thought about it, turned back to me and said, no. And in many respects, that has defined my time here, is trying to disprove that against a certain body of evidence. And so when I was going through my confirmation hearings almost 2 years ago, at a time when the watchword in the Sahel that certainly Michael will recognize was democratic backsliding. And so Senator Booker of New Jersey asked me what I was going to do to reverse this democratic backsliding in Chad. And my response, which has sort of become my
it appears that we've lost the ambassador here. Ambassador Lascaris, can you hear me?
I expect he'll reconnect. It probably is just a connection issue for a second there.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for him to reconnect, Michael Walsh, do you want to give us your remarks, your introduction?
Yeah, happy to. So I was here to provide context anyway, so it works out. So I'll provide the context of what's going on. So the main issue with Chad is that it's one of the democracy's security paradox countries. From a U.S. standpoint, the U.S. has traditionally had two main interests in the region. I mean, the first one is on the defense and security side, and Chad has traditionally been viewed as a buffer country. Its location, although it's often talked about being part of the Sahel, it's also talked about in other contexts as being part of Central Africa. And as other contexts, it's talked about as being a buffer between the violent extremism that happens in the Sahel and what's going on in Sudan and Libya and further east and north. And so strategically, geopolitically, and geostrategically, it's always been viewed as an important country in the last 10 years when we talk about regional security interests of the United States. Another main interest of the United States traditionally has just been trying to engage in cultural diplomacy in the region and trying to promote, engagement with the U.S. and understanding of the U.S. and what the U.S. interests are in the region, and trying to create a positive impression of the United States across the region. Chad's an interesting country because you have so many different groups of people, especially migrants, who have been either temporarily or permanently stuck in Chad, as well as refugees who are fleeing violence in the neighboring states. And so Chad has always been a country that you reach a lot of people in who aren't necessarily locals. So there's a huge diasporic community that kind of exists within Chad. And the refugee community is massive. I mean, it's a huge burden, obviously, on the economy. It's a huge burden on the region. So when we look at Chad and we're trying to understand Chad, one of the ways we can do that is by looking at what the United States has stated American objectives are in Chad. And the United States has a strategy, and it's talked about what its plan is for quite some time. And this, each administration has its own take on it. And the current administration has three main pillars that they're trying to engage on. The first one was to focus on the democratic institutions and, transition Chad back towards democracy. And we obviously saw Masra's return in November, and a push that was led really by the economic community of Central African states. And I think this is surprising to a lot of people, because people always, when they think of the Sahel, they think of ECOWAS, and they think of West Africa, and they think of the role that ECOWAS was trying to play in Niger and Mali and all of these other things. I think that the interesting thing about Chad is Chad straddles a whole bunch. It's on the periphery of multiple regions at once. And so you have different actors who come to play in Chad than you have come to play in Mali and Niger. And so it's very interesting. So Masra returned in November. He obviously accepted the position and is now, in a leadership role. But for some people that dashed hopes that there is going to be a full transition, and they saw that as not a win. So you have two sides of that equation. But it definitely does move the goalpost closer towards strengthening democratic institutions. It's just a question of whether they will continue to strengthen. Second sort of strategic objective for the United States in the region has been making sure that Chad is a stable and secure, capable partner for the United States in the region. Now, Chad has played a huge role in counterterrorism and the fight against violent extremism for quite some time. It plays a very prominent role. Obviously, those relationships following the coups in the rest of the Sahel have been strained. And so that's made Chad an even more important country in the global struggle against violent extremism. There are indications, and there have been indications, that there's a trans-regional nature to the violence that's happening in Sudan. There's obviously a trans-regional nature of what's happening in Libya. So Chad can't be viewed in isolation. And so the violence that the ambassador talked about, I mean, there's multiple levels of violence. There's violence that Chad is,
Well, it's looking
indirectly.
like, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. You were cut off there for a minute.
So there's violence that Chad is indirectly, privy to because of its position relative to Libya and to Sudan. And there's rebel groups who have been engaged in violence around the region. So you have to think about, when we think about, the violence and about stability and security, there's the security and stability within Chad, and then there's security and stability within the region and what role Chad can play in strengthening that. And then the final part is really about the people of Chad and trying to make sure that the people of Chad have a better future. Chad has always had a very difficult time in the world when you look at global rankings and sustainable development goals and all of these things. And the life expectancy actually went down for a period of time, which is remarkable given how low it was to begin with. So there's a huge opportunity there for the United States to play a constructive role to help with a very little, sunk cost, to increase the prosperity and improve the lives of ordinary people in Chad. And so to move those goalposts, because they're so low already, it wouldn't take a lot. It takes political capital, and it takes, economic partnerships and a lot of public-private partnerships to make that happen. And I'm sure the ambassador has been working hard to make that happen. So I'll leave with that and sort of set the stage for the ambassador to continue his remarks.
Yeah, thanks. I switched over to the cell phone. Can you hear me?
Yes, gotcha.
Good. Yeah. So I've got three overlapping mandates here: global, regional, and national or local. And as any ambassador, I constantly working on all three fronts. So on a global level, frankly, Chad is not a bad partner. There were 6 resolutions in the UN General Assembly about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Chad, unlike many of its African fellows, voted with us, voted with our European partners to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, President Deby was in Moscow the other day, so we'll see if any of that changes. But on issues, on the war in the Gaza, the Chadians called for a ceasefire, condemned the Israelis, but also condemned Hamas. The president gave a very strong speech a couple of days ago, where he reiterated his revulsion at the Hamas attacks of October 7th. Issues such as climate change, things that we care about on a global level. Chad I think, has gone out of its way to be a good partner to us internationally. Regionally, it's a shifting picture because there have been sea changes in the last year. The successive coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have really put the West, what we here call the Western Sahel counterterrorism agenda, at least on hold. Chad has been a good, credible partner in what we call the Multinational Joint Task Force, which is the CT efforts around Lake Chad vis-a-vis Boko Haram. They're certainly the most capable military of the 4 participants in the Multinational Joint Task Force. And right now, they're probably the only serious, credible threat or pressure on Boko networks in and around the lake. On the Central African Republic, which borders us to the south, Chad has been a pretty constructive partner for us, trying to ease or trying to move President Touadéra away from his, I think, catastrophic relations or alliance with the Russians and with the Wagner Group, helping us diffuse a couple regional situations. So I've got good dialogue with them. If you look to the north, the steady state at southern Libya is chaotic, and we've got good dialogue with the Chadians, not yielding a lot of global progress towards a resolution of the Libya conflict. But by and large, I would describe the Chadians as certainly as an affected or interested party in Libya. Grateful that we stopped just talking to the Europeans and the Egyptians and the Tunisians, and we actually focus on the Sahelian dynamic of the Libya crisis. So I think on Libya, they've been pretty good partners. Sudan historically has been mixed. I would say on the positive side of the ledger, the government and people of Chad are very good refugee hosts. We've got about 1 million or so new Darfurian refugees. I should say total Darfurian refugees, plus significant refugee communities from all the neighboring states. I've worked in countries where host governments tax us, steal our vehicles, loot our warehouses, harass our humanitarian workers. But for the lack of money, humanitarian operations responding to refugee crises in Chad are actually pretty easy. And unlike, if you spent time in Kenya, the Somali presence there is bitterly resented in some quarters of Kenyan society. None of that here. Frankly, a lot of it is transactional. A lot of the Chadians I deal with have been refugees, and so they remember what it's like to be on the other side of the equation. So I will say, the coup in Niger, to the Chadian mindset, the coup in Niger, to a lesser extent in Mali and Burkina Faso, has vindicated in their minds their model of government, which is saying that strong authoritarian states are needed. These fragile postmodern construct democratic states don't have the staying power to survive in rough neighborhoods. I don't agree with that, but I do think it has some intellectual validity that we should consider. And I phrase this in terms of Max Weber and the definition of a state as having a monopoly on legitimate violence in a defined area. And with the exception of a small strip at the extreme north of Chad, where there's a gold rush going on, Chad is the only state in the region that has a monopoly of legitimate violence in its territory. And every once in a while, the government gets mad at me, and I very often go walking in the countryside here, and I post photos on Facebook of me walking through the villages, greeting people, and I get a call from the presidency the other day saying, Mr. Ambassador, we love to see you out and about, enjoying our country and meeting our people. You do realize you're the only American ambassador in the region who can take a pleasure walk in the countryside in his country of assignment. There is something to be said. There's something to be said for that. So, okay, I think the global cooperation is pretty good. The regional cooperation is good with some hiccups. But the third part of my mandate is the most difficult and the most challenging, and that is, my specific mandate is someone who arrived on the eve of the national dialogue in August of 22, with a mandate to help in any way possible this dialogue achieve what has never been done before, which is a constitutional transition of power, either between a sitting president or to a new president. As I noted in my confirmation hearings, no head of state in Chad has ever left power voluntarily. One by the bullet, two the rest chased out, by armed rebellion. So the question here is not who governs Chad. I don't care. We don't care who governs Chad. The question is, how is Chad governed? And Chad I orient Americans to Chad by saying it's 3 times the size of Texas. It has the population of New York State, and it has the national budget of the Washington, D.C. public school system. Now, I live about a mile west of Howard in Adams Morgan, so I'm very familiar with my native District of Columbia. It's got, it had 3 pre-colonial empires that were in existence when my grandfather was alive. So my grandfather was born in 1897 in Ottoman Thessaloniki. If he had been born in Chad, he would have been born subject to a sultan of Bagirme, Wadai, or Kanem. So it's had this speed of light development from pre-colonial empire to colonial occupation to fairly delicate, postmodern construct. And Chad has always been governed by narrow kinship-based or regional-based interests for the advantage of a few and to the disadvantage of the many. The question is, can that change? Yeah, I personally think it can. I think the arrival of Succès Masra in as prime minister is important. The question is, will we have a 100% electoral solution here, which is what we want, which is what I'm working for? I'm not sure. Will we have a violent resolution, which is what we don't want? I think the arrival of Masra means we have a better chance of avoiding a violent struggle for power than in the past. So where does that leave us? In between those two extremes is some sort of hybrid, semi-electoral, semi-negotiated sharing of power. It's not ideal. I live in Chad, which is, as Michael pointed out, is 185th of 188 on the Human Development Index, and a history of pretty bad mismanagement. So if we can figure out some way, working with our Chadian partners and international partners, to arrive at some sort of process by which there is an electoral dimension, and perhaps in the early going a negotiated dimension, I think that's a suboptimal result, but it's not a bad result for our time. Over.
Thank you, both of you. I'd like to, I actually had dozens of questions rolling through my mind as you two were talking, and trying to decide, what would be the most interesting place to start. And you mentioned something about the Russians, which, that's always on everyone's mind, is that you've got the Wagner Group, what's the reconstituted Wagner Group. It's difficult to tell just what it is these days, but you have it still rearing its head in the Sahel and in other parts of Africa, which is a troublesome thing. What is the Russian presence in Chad?
It's fairly modest. You know, Chad has, again, voted with us on all the Ukrainian resolutions, has been a pretty consistent opponent of Wagner, certainly in the Central African Republic. No enthusiasm for Wagner in Mali, Burkina. Wagner, in the person of Prigozhin, has been present in Darfur in alliance with Hemeti, which poses problems for our policy. And the Chadians, I think, have accommodated that more than I personally would like. Wagner is also present in southern Libya alongside the forces of Khalifa Haftar. As far as I can tell, that gold rush region of northern Libya, northern Chad, southern Libya is pretty much, the Wild West, the Star Wars bar of shifting alliances. But the Chadians are aware of the Wagner threat in their region. They're aware of a potential Wagner threat here, and President Deby has said publicly and privately that he will never surrender Chadian sovereignty to anyone. And I think in the cases, looking at the essentially state capture going on to the south in the Central African Republic, I think that's the model to be avoided. But yeah, so I think on Wagner issues, I think Chad has been a pretty good partner over.
Okay, another question. You talk about your mandate from to try and get to an electoral, and I guess the question on my mind there is, given Chad's state of economic underdevelopment, and I'm sure there are some, the Wild West of the gold area, but I'm sure they have security issues. How do you balance the equation of giving them the sense of security while finding ways to push development that gives start the process of building that class of society that can bubble up and sort of demand its share of power in the end, whether it's by our calendar or by theirs? And where do you strike the balance between achieving security and working to promote development?
With the Chadians, like I say, the government of Chad is very explicit that the existence of the security it provides is a precondition for any kind of development. And their point, which again is a valid observation, is their writ extends throughout the national territory. I think at the expense of guns and butter issues, at the expense of schools, clinics, roads, etc., between the army, the police, and the intel service, again with the exception of a very small narrow band of territory, they have physical control. Their authority holds over almost all their national territory. I think that's an acceptable starting point. I think it's a better starting point than the contrary. I think to the Chadians, or at least to the government, has articulated that the way we've been able to achieve this is through, to be perfectly candid, they're not quite as blunt with me as I'm about to be, but through less of a focus on participatory Jeffersonian democracy than on authoritarianism. And I go back to Max Weber, because he talked about legitimate violence, but it was not a moral benediction. He said it can come from multiple sources. And I think Chad, at least, again, I don't like this, but I think it does pass the Weber test of the state, the definition of a state. I think the challenge for me is to pocket the security gains and say, okay, I'll see your security and I'll raise you broader democracy, broader development. The government, a couple of days ago, government took a step that I really welcome and I've been pushing for privately, and I'm absolutely delighted they lifted import tariffs on staple commodities, sorghum, flour, rice, things like that. And some of the governors here, I think, are quite progressive, have lifted checkpoints off the road, have allowed the free flow of goods and services. So look, as I pointed out, this country is run on the budget of the Washington, D.C. public school system, which is about $1.9 billion a year. So no matter how you cut it, it's going to be poor. It doesn't have to be as poor as it is if you just liberalize, let people go about their lives, whether they are fishermen, farmers, herders, or petty traders. So I understand the potential trade-off between security and participatory democracy. They also, their line is, well, we've got 120 linguistic groups here. We've got, people, cultures from the forest, from the savannah, and from the desert. An election would be a de facto ethnic census, which is often the case in post-transition areas. and my pitch back to them is, well, if that would be an easier pill to swallow if the record of economic management were better. So that's sort of the terms of the debate we have here. Over.
Okay. Mike, you want to add anything to that?
I think that the point the ambassador made is critical, and I think it's one of the big misunderstandings when we talk about what's going on in Central and West Africa. You can't start talking about democracy if you don't have a state. And so having a state is critical. And that doesn't just mean having a seat at the United Nations. That means exactly what the ambassador was saying, which is having control over a defined territory. And what we've seen is many of the quote unquote states that exist in the region lack that. So I think you have a precondition now for democracy. And I think that's important. And it's how you use it. And I think when we're talking about what the ambassador was saying about democracy and security trade-offs, that gets to the point of this whole idea of a democracy security paradox. And what the ambassador is saying is that the US doesn't view it through the lens of a democracy security paradox. It's not one or the other. And I think that's an important point to make as well. I think from a US standpoint and from a White House standpoint, when we look at Chad, it's become incredibly more important to the US now than it was a year ago. When you just look at the Democracy Summit, we put Niger up on a stage at the second Democracy Summit, talking about, Niger was an example of an emerging democracy. And look at where Niger is today. And so, at the second Democracy Summit, the president said that democracies in the world are getting stronger. But then we had the report come out from IDEA, this fall, which said that across every single region of the world, democracy is contracting. So any progress that can be made on democracy in Chad will actually help to advance the agenda of the White House and the United States government. And so I think it's important in this national debate about the role between democracies and authoritarians in the world and the struggle between the two in a way that it wasn't a year ago. And so I think there's an opportunity there to get the political capital that's needed to be able to do the things that the ambassador needs to be done to build that relationship and demonstrate progress on democracy.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Lascaris, I have one other question, and this is sort of hearkening back to my own days being a charge in one country in Africa and an ambassador in another. What kind of relationship do you have with our European allies who have a diplomatic presence there in terms of having a sort of a coordinated approach to the local government and the local people?
Yeah. I was coming for lunch with my EU colleagues, what we call in the UK, what we call our like-minded group. So we're our view is if we agree with each other 80% of the time, that's more than enough to form the basis of common action. The EU is the largest donor here. We're the largest humanitarian donor. The EU, the bank, and the fund are the largest economic and development donors. One of the challenges of working in Africa, as you know, is the former colonial powers. They are both an asset and a liability. They're an asset in the sense that they have the strongest domestic constituency. They're usually more eager to leverage UN, EU, World Bank, IMF resources on behalf of their former colonial possessions. At the same time, they have strong cultural, historical, linguistic links. At the same time, I assume I've never served in Latin America, but I assume we're regarded somewhat the same way in parts of Central America. I've never been there. But it's defined by a love-hate relationship. I think we've all seen the outpouring of popular discontent with the French presence and historic presence in the recent years or months in the Western Sahel. It's a reality. If you I've worked in former British, Portuguese, Belgian, German, and French colonies, and so in each one, and Italian in the case of Libya. So it's always a challenge, but no, we're pretty much joined at the hip with our European like-minded allies. I will say one of the things that's changed in our time in Africa, Ambassador, is the arrival of new actors. Russia, China have always been here in various guises, but the Gulf states, the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Saudis, and the Turks, are major actors in parts of Africa. That's just a new reality that neither good nor bad that we're adjusting to. Over.
Thank you. Speaking of other actors, and this is an issue that doesn't come up very often in the media here. But one country that I'm seeing more and more, getting more and more of a footprint in parts of Africa that the media seems to have not noticed is India. Do you have an Indian presence in Chad, and what's the impact?
It's funny you mentioned that. Actually, yesterday was Constitution Day in India, so we were at a reception hosted by the Indian ambassador, who's just arrived, first ambassador. So let's talk about it in a year, and I'll tell you. But thus far, I mean, they're big in other parts of Africa. Obviously, very large diaspora communities, as you know, in the East. They've not been a factor here, but they just got here.
Well, thank you. And now I notice we've started to get questions lining up in the Q&A, and that means the audience is very interested in having their questions answered. So I'm going to turn it over now to President Flynn to moderate the questions from our audience.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ray, and thank you to our speakers today. We have a lot of questions, so we may not be able to get to all of them. I'm going to start with one from a former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Chad, Ambassador Christopher Goldthwait, who notes in the comments of Ambassador Lascaris and Mr. Walsh, I heard lots of continuity since I returned from my tour as ambassador to Chad exactly 20 years ago this month. What, if anything, would either speaker say has fundamentally changed in the last 20 years?
I think the regional context has radically changed. 20 years ago, I was backpacking through the Dogon country of Mali, listening to Ayad Ghali produced desert blues concerts. Gaddafi was still in power. So the regional context has shifted seismically. 20 years ago, when Ambassador Goldthwait, hi Ambassador Goldthwait, when he left, the Deby family had been in power for about 10 years. 20 years later, the Deby family, the clan of the sub-clan of the Bidiyat still have a largely a monopoly on power. Chad is still at the bottom of most of the rankings of the Human Development Index, Transparency International, et cetera. So it's a little depressing to acknowledge this to you, Ambassador, but probably not enough has changed in Chad since your time over.
Okay. Any comments, Michael?
Well, I'd say the global context has changed a lot as well. So when you look at the situation, I mean, the ambassador talked about emerging actors. I mean, we always talk about Russia and China and the United States in the context of Africa. And France obviously is a predominant, actor in the parts that they used to have as colonies. However, I think what's changing is now you're hearing a lot more talk about Qatar and about UAE and about Saudi Arabia. And, Chad borders Sudan. And the reality is that those actors are playing a role there, but they're playing a role throughout the region. And the nexus between having capital and ports and other sort of economic assets that give people access to the global economy and can really work as moderators to being part of the global network and trade network has been a big factor in all of this. And so when you look at, the Dubai World Ports and all of the things that they've done across Africa, that you can't discount the economic side of it as well. It's not just security, and there's a security economic nexus that's happening there. And when you look at Chad, when you talk about how do you improve the prosperity of Chad, one of the ways to improve the prosperity of Chad is to provide Chad with some sort of safe and secure access to ports. It's a landlocked country. And right now that context has shifted radically. I mean, you obviously look at the civil wars that are happening in Libya and in Sudan, and Cameroon is a mess as well. And so, when you look at, their options, it's really hard to take a truck and drive it to a port from Chad. And so that is a limiting factor for their economic growth if they could ever, manage the economy and get it moving in a way that they can have any sort of export options or import options aside from just basic foods and basic needs. And so I think that's a huge challenge for them.
Thank you.
The other cosmic change for the ambassador is 20 years, maybe dating myself, is the oil sector. Starting in the early 2000s, Conoco did the original exploration. Exxon built the pipeline infrastructure. Chad is now exporting. I think we're about 150,000 barrels a day, which securely through a pipeline that goes to the Cameroonian coast. This question of Chad's access to ports is absolutely fascinating because, here at N'Djamena, we get stuff up from Douala. Up in the lake, it comes from Tripoli, and Abeshe, it comes from Benghazi and Port Sudan. It's really an extraordinary hodgepodge of commercial routes, none of which serve Chad's interest well. So I agree with Michael on that. The other thing I've discovered here is a good portion of Nigerian sesame and Chadian gum arabic, Chadian gum arabic and Chadian sesame is exported fraudulently as Sudanese or Nigerian origin. So I think the untapped potential of this place in the agro livestock sector is off the charts. Over.
Thank you. A couple questions. We actually have a question that asked about the petroleum situation, and just to add a couple more questions related to that. This Jacqueline Reich of Chestnut Hill College, a professor there, asks, who are the customers for Chadian oil? Who are the beneficiaries of Chad oil sales, and how is the oil transported out of this landlocked country? You explained how it was transported, but a little bit more on who are the beneficiaries and who are the customers.
Well, the customer is a global spot market. It's exported via a terminal on the coast of Cameroon, special built port, I think north of Douala, whose gas tank it ends up into. I couldn't tell you. I'm not sure how relevant it is. Beneficiaries is a more problematic question because Ambassador Goldthwait might remember that this was a model program co-funded by the investment arm of the World Bank with a focus on worker rights, with a focus on environmental protection, with a focus on local development and skill transfer. And in many ways, in some ways, it's worked quite well. In some ways, less so. And part of it was a percentage, 10% of the revenues accrue to local communities in the oil patch in the south. That hasn't worked out as well. And there's some bitterness in Chad, which is understandable. And I've been in other oil-producing countries. I served in Angola, where at the national level, people feel that the benefits of this oil windfall has not accrued to them, in the form of jobs, services, education, et cetera. And at the local level, there's also a sense that this extraction is going on in our communities, and we're paying the environmental price, but not getting any of the financial benefits. So from a national income perspective, it's been a windfall for Chad. I think if I were running for office in Chad, I would focus on where's the money and why isn't it flowing to schools, clinics, hospitals, et cetera. Over.
Let me just also, you've brought up the gold rush in the north. Can you talk a little bit, Michael and Ambassador, on the gold rush? What is it? What's happening? And to whom are the benefits going to accrue from that?
I can let the ambassador talk at length about what's going on with the black market gold market that's happening. On the official markets, I mean, Chad has three sort of large exports, and oil is the one that everyone knows. Gold is the second one, and then it's really oily seeds is a category that gets exported, and those are the three things that are talked about. When we talk about where stuff goes, I mean, the main trading partners of Chad, I mean, one of them is UAE. And that's because everything goes through UAE. So that the huge gold market, obviously, in UAE. And so I think when we talk about gold specifically, that's an area where you have to talk about the Gulf states, especially UAE. We see this in Zimbabwe. We see this all over the world. When we start talking about gold markets and we start talking about illicit flows and other things, it's not that UAE is a problem country in the sense, it's just the fact that they have a massive gold market, and that's what happens. And so it's got to go somewhere, and that's where it goes and gets refined and processed and everything else. And so there's a connection there. So when we talk about the gold market specifically, we have to talk about the UAE. And I think the ambassador can talk more about the black market.
Yeah. Unfortunately, very little of that revenue accrues to the state. As I said, the government of Chad has physical control of all of its territory, with the exception of a very narrow band that happens over the last 15 years, 12, 15 years, to have a gold rush going on. It's a labor suck. It's a human trafficking nightmare. It's a human rights nightmare. It's also, the nexus of gold smuggling, arms smuggling, drug smuggling, people smuggling. It's as far as I can tell, it's an anarchic, bandit infested area. It's the one part of Chad that I don't think I'm going to get to. I'm pretty sure I could get up there. I'm not 100% sure I could get back. The government has tried through armed force, through negotiation, to exert its authority. I think the forces lining up against it, including the so-called Tibesti self-defense councils, plus the terrain, this sort of mountainous terrain populated by Montagnard Tubu, who are pretty good at fighting. It's a mess, and I agree with Michael. A lot of the illegally mined ore ends up via Libya in Dubai for refining. But it's a catastrophe on the human rights side, on the environmental side, on the governance side, and it's a major blow to one of the poorest countries in the world, losing out on X amount of revenue. I've heard figures. There's nothing I could really put. There's no figure I could give you that I have confidence in, but it's a lot, and it would be well spent if it were diverted to the state. Over.
And Rolly, I'll just add real quickly that I think this is the gap in U.S. State Department strategy, and I think there's an opportunity here across the continent, is that there isn't a good alignment in our strategies in Near East and Africa, not nearly as far as there should be. And I think in order to fix this issue, there has to be stronger alignment between our regional bureaus and individual country level embassies. And that means the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi. And there needs to be a lot more integration there, and it has to be prioritized. And for that to happen, those priorities have to start coming from the African missions, and they have to be prioritized at a national level. And so if that doesn't happen, this isn't something that the U.S. Embassy Abu Dhabi is going to take on as a top level issue. It would take all the ambassadors in Africa telling U.S. Embassy Abu Dhabi and then making that case to Blinken's office that this is a national priority issue. And that hasn't happened yet. But if that did happen, then you could see some progress on this front.
Thank you. We have another economic question. What are the top 2 economic investments that could be made in Chad to grow their economy? Either of you would like to take that?
I tend to think it's in the agricultural livestock domains. One of the we focus on human demography, but one of the realities here is animal demography or livestock demography. The size of the national herd has gone from about 25 million head of cattle to about 120 million head of cattle in the last 20 years. That probably reflects the fact that the people who run the country are semi-nomadic pastoralists who keep and run cattle. It's led to all sorts of communal tensions in the South over grazing rights and land tenure issues. But the livestock potential of this place is off the charts. The southern third of Chad is well watered, rich farmland. Frankly, historically it was a major cotton producing region, although the cotton parastatal here is in pretty bad shape. I mentioned sesame oil. I mentioned also gum arabic again, which doesn't get attention because I think a lot of it is exported clandestinely to the global market as Sudanese origin. So in terms of the maximum revenue and the maximum benefit for local communities, I would say without a doubt it's agricultural. I was talking to U.S. Geological Service. There are untapped mineral deposits, not gold, such as potentially as lithium out there. So I think there's a potential to grow the mining sector here, which is good on producing revenue, less well on producing jobs. And the oil sector, the oil production has significant capacity to expand. The pipeline has an untapped capacity, and the wells itself here are rich. So I think between agriculture, livestock, minerals not called gold, and additional oil capacity, again, I think you could make some real progress on revenue and social welfare here. Over.
And I think that could actually be amplified if we did more in the States and in European countries where there's Chadi and diaspora populations. I think with the Ethiopian population in DC, and the ambassador is familiar with this from being from DC, we have a huge Ethiopian population, and there's a lot of Ethiopian restaurants, and there's a lot of promotion of Ethiopian goods. And I've had this conversation with the Chadi ambassador to the United States. I think there's a huge opportunity here if we could get restaurants and we could get markets and we could get people invested in Western countries who are immigrants, in promoting Chad and Chad goods. When you're talking about an economy the size of Chad, it's so small. You know, the immediate impact of that would be massive. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there. And I think, you know, it requires very little sunk cost. I mean, you can have a Chad food cart pull up in front of the embassy once a week and have a block party like the Colombians do. You know, there are things that could be done at very low cost that could have massive impact over a long-term time horizon. I mean, it's not going to change the state of affairs tomorrow. But I think that that's part of this is the Chadian diaspora community isn't as high profile, isn't as you know, engaged in U.S. Africa affairs as some other diaspora groups are. And I think that that's a missed opportunity, and I think we have to fix that.
Yeah, let me jump in. Speaking of Ethiopian diaspora, I was doing my annual physical last month in DC, and the blood draw at Georgetown Hospital was an Ethiopian nurse who wanted to lecture me about the situation in Tigray. I said, oh, you know, with all due respect, you know, I got other things on my mind right now. I will say, look, investment, there's a truism out there, a couple of truisms. One is capital is coward, and the other is you get the investment you deserve. And, you know, investment as we know it that leads to economic growth and prosperity rests on the rule of law. And frankly, the rule of law is an area of significant developmental opportunity here in Chad, as we say, and security of contracts, the sanctity of contracts, the enforceability of contracts. These are the things that have driven investors out before, and these are things that we in Chad have to improve to make this a platform for the right kind of engagement, of investment. Otherwise, you get the wrong kind of investment. Over.
Yeah, thank you. We have a bunch more questions. I'm just going to read this one. In the context of a violent and rigged national dialogue, a rigged constitutional referendum, and the likely rigged election upcoming, why should we view Masra's appointment as anything other than a cover for Debby's consolidation of power? Something that gets us to say that they are moving toward democracy, when in fact he is just consolidating his power. And there's one more question I'll tie to this, which is what would be the repercussions if Masra decides to run for president in October? Is that a possibility? And how would Debby react?
Boy, that's a bit of a landmine question. I will say, to take the last part of that, I don't know his plans. I saw him the other day for the first time. I just got back from the holidays a week ago, so I saw him for the first time, and I asked him, you know, the "Are you running?" question. He didn't exactly give me the General Sherman response, but he said, I think correctly, look, I'm focused on making this succeed. I'm focused on a successful tenure as the head of government. I'm focused on a successful transition. You know, I was at the National Dialogue. It started 2 days after I got here. I was disappointed. The way I described it was a very free and open debate with an unfortunately directed conclusion. You know, the constitutional referendum was run by the Ministry of Territorial Administration on a monopoly basis, and our European partners and I made a consistent point that the credibility of an election is directly proportional to the number of people around the table overseeing it, and if it is dominated or monopolized by the government and party in power, I think it legitimately raises questions about the integrity of the process. So one of the very first items on our agenda as we talk to the new government is the reform of what they're now calling the ANGE, the National Agency for the Management of Elections, precisely for that reason, to say that you can't be basketball player and referee in the same game. So Masra coming in again, any post-transition political solution is going to have an electoral and a negotiated element. And, is it going to be 90-10 or 10-90 or 50-50? I don't know. But, I lived the violence of October 20th, 2022, including outside my embassy. I don't want to repeat that. We've complained to the government about what we believe is the overreaction and the draconian response of security forces. I don't want that to happen again. And that's my goal. Over.
Thank you. Michael, any comments on that?
I mean, I think you have to look at where Chad is on the democracy index. I mean, it's an authoritarian state. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. And so, and there's certain things that ambassadors can't say. And so I think think tank people can say, that comment that was made is one of the common sort of criticisms of the appointment. There is that discourse out there. But I will say, and I'm pretty much on the record over time as trying to speak truth to power, and I believe very strongly in giving an objective view of things. I think that when you're dealing with an authoritarian state where it sits in the rankings, to be able to have the opposition leader come back and to have a position is something of value, and it can't be discarded. I mean, there was a concern a couple months ago that he'd be arrested on the spot when he came back. So, there is progress. And so I don't think we should discount progress. I think that when we look towards the future, when we look at what we're trying to achieve, I don't know what Chad is right now. It's like 1 point something on the democracy index. If it ends up flipping with where Niger is on the democracy index and gets ahead of Niger, and we were standing last year talking about how Niger was a model of democratic consolidation on the continent, then what does that say about us? I mean, we have to maintain consistency in how we portray the region and what we expect of the region. And so if Chad is moving in that direction and Niger is moving in the opposite direction, then I think we have to at least give some real sort of value to what's happened over the last couple of months in Chad.
Okay, we still have a lot more questions and just a few minutes left, so I'll carry on. Can you expand on why Debbie's visit to Russia occurred? Debbie has been flirting with Russia for many months, but in the context of Russia deploying trainers to Burkina this week and the Nigerian PM's visit there last week to sign a new security agreement, how much of a game changer for us is this new relationship? And how much do you think that this new relationship is about Debbie's own personal regime security, given that we are hearing a lot of disgruntlement among Zagawa elites for Debbie's relationship with UAE and his siding with the RSF in Sudan?
Yeah, look, he got back last night. I was held up in traffic as his motorcade came from the airport to the presidency. So it's brand new. I don't have insider readouts of it. What I do have is what he said publicly, and he repeatedly returned to the word sovereignty. And I think that was a double message. I think it was a message to the Russians. Whatever assistance I take from you, it will in no way diminish my sovereignty, and he's told me that in private. The government has reiterated that. So I think the first part of that sovereignty message was to his hosts in Moscow. I think the second part of his message was to the likes of you and I, to the Europeans, to the French, to us, saying, we're a sovereign country. We have the right to conduct our foreign relations as we see fit according to our interests. So the short answer to that question is watch this space. Over.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to another one. I understand that humanitarian assistance, disaster relief issues could be a strong hook for making gains with women, peace, and security goals in Chad. What is the appetite for including more women in the defense world? And is HADR, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, the best hook, or are there other opportunities to support Chad in including women in the defense security arenas?
Well, let me say again, so we don't pile on Chad. Chad is actually pretty good on women in the workplace type issues, whether it's civilian ministries, the private sector, to include the military. They're ahead of a lot of African militaries on integration of women into the force, both in numbers and in terms of missions. I think combat's probably a bridge too far, certainly for the Chadian machismo. So I think on that side of actually having women represented in the security services, police, army, and others, Chad's actually doing pretty well. So I'll give him credit for that. I will say the gender-based violence stories we're hearing out of Darfur are absolutely heartbreaking and appalling. I had a team of WHO psychiatrists in the office the other day, and we got a problem. And what we're hearing from women in particular and girls is awful. And so, yeah, we've got to respond to that. And the way I see it is, you have to open the lens to stop looking at women and girls as merely victims, but start looking them as the implementers and the beneficiaries of the programs that you're doing to target them. Yeah, it's been a nightmare watching a million souls cross the border, each with an appalling tale. Over.
Thank you. I'm going to lump the two last questions together because we have less than 3 minutes, maybe 2 minutes to go. First, these are both questions about the neighborhood. How will Chad be stable in a Sahel in turbulence? Tense relationships between Mali and Algeria, the rise of all kinds of traffic in southern Morocco and northern Mauritania. In Morocco, we are following this case of Escobar of the Sahara. This Malian drug trafficker has fallen from political heads in the kingdom. And the other question, how do you see the tribal dynamics between Chad and Sudan? And how's that going to affect the overall civil war currently happening in Sudan and the relationship of Chad with this conflict? How's this going to affect its stability and its current power as having an active role in the ongoing conflict in Sudan? So talk about the neighborhood. Michael, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I remember back in 2004, and we were talking about GSPC, and we were talking about, the illicit cigarette smuggling across the region. I mean, this isn't something new. This has been going on for decades, if not centuries, across the region. So there's a lot of networks, there's a lot of illicit goods, there's a lot of things happening. So when you talk about this, there's the state actor side of the house, and there's the non-state actor side of the house. And so on the non-state actor side of the house, those networks have continued throughout the entire global war on terrorism. I mean, they've been disrupted, they've been changed, they've evolved, but they're there, and they're always going to be there. And that's just part of the nature of how the region works. On the state side, I do think that the changing dynamics that are going on between Algeria and Morocco's role in the region will have an impact in the Eastern Sahara, not just the Western Sahara. I think it's a continent-wide thing that's happening right there with Morocco. But I think when we're talking about Sudan specifically, we've talked a lot about UAE, we've talked a lot about what's happening in Sudan. Sudan has a lot of effect on what happens for the future of Chad. And I just think it's probably Libya and Sudan have an oversized impact on what's going to happen in the future trajectory of Chad.
Thank you. Ambassador Lascaris, in less than 30 seconds, do you have anything to add to this?
Well, the players and the commodities change. The routes are the historical constant, as Michael correctly pointed out. These routes are going to be there. They're going to take advantage of state weakness to divert. It's a game of whack-a-mole. It does argue for, again, the Chadian thesis that a security-led form of governance presents certain advantages. Again, I don't necessarily like that every day when I hear it, but there is some intellectual validity to it. And I will say, because of the group that has governed Chad since 1990, Darfurian politics are local politics here in the N'Djamena Game of Thrones. And so what happens in Darfur is very important for what happens in Chad. Over.
Thank you. Thank you all to our panel, Michael Walsh, Ambassador Lascaris, and Ambassador Ray. Superb discussion. To our audience, again, a reminder that we give these to you for free. They're not free to us, and please do support us. And to our panelists, I hope you come and see us if you're ever our way in Philadelphia. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.